Nobody is perfect, not even our friends or family members who appear to lead perfect, guilt-free lives. Striving for perfection in any part of our lives is a recipe for failure since it can never be attained. We all make mistakes, and many of us go down a path in our lives that make us feel guilty later on when we finally realize our mistake. God knows I have. Key, however, is to realize the mistake and accept that you're only human. Don't engage in days, weeks, or months of self-blame or battering your self-esteem because you should have known, should have acted differently, or should have been an ideal person. You're not perfect and neither am I. That's just life. Guilt is one of those emotions that we feel is telling us something important. But be aware that not every emotion, and certainly not every guilty feeling, is a rational one that has a purpose. Focus on the guilt that causes loved ones or friends harm, and remember to be skeptical the next time you feel guilty. Ask your guilt questions. Is it trying to teach you something rational and helpful about your behavior, or is it just an emotional, irrational response to a situation? The answer to that question will be your first step to helping you better cope with guilt in the future. Guilt and its handmaiden shame can paralyze, or thankfully catalyze one into action. Appropriate guilt can function as social glue, spurring one to make reparations for wrongs. Excessive rumination about one's failures, however, is a surefire recipe for resentment and depression. Many of our lives are governed by guilt, and I would add the more religious we are, the more this is true. Psychologists identify three kinds of guilt: real guilt as a form of responsibility for wronging or hurting others, guilt as a false defense against angst, and existential guilt. For example, feeling guilty because you were born in America and not Africa. Well, how do I know what is real guilt? The most obvious reason to feel guilty is that you actually did something wrong. This type of guilt may involve harm to others, such as causing someone physical or psychological pain. You may also feel guilty because you violated your own ethical or moral code, such as cheating, lying, or stealing. Well, guilt over your own behavior can also be caused by doing something you swore you would never do again, like smoking, drinking, or overeating. In each of these cases, there's no doubt that the behavior occurred. It's appropriate to feel guilty when you've done something wrong. Feeling the emotion of guilt for an action deserving of remorse is normal. To not feel guilty in these cases may be a sign of psychopathy. The problems occur when you ruminate over this guilt. An action in the past cannot be changed, no matter how much you wish it would. Accept the fact that it happened, apologize to the person or persons you harmed, and then figure out how to avoid committing the same act in the future. If you violated your own personal standards, such as through overuse of alcohol or cheating on your partner, you can best avoid straying in the future by seeking support from others or help from a qualified therapist who can help you rid yourself of this habit or help you understand the reasons behind why the transgression occurred. None of us can afford the casual comfort of innocence. So part of the legitimate development of a person is the appropriate acknowledgement of guilt, which is to say the acceptance of responsibility for the consequences of one's choices. So remember these three R's. Recognition. Consciousness involves the recognition of harm done to self or other. 2. Recompense. Many things cannot be undone. In most cases, the recompense one offers is symbolic, no less real for that, but clearly an act of psychological return for that which has been taken. And then 3, release. When contrition is genuine, when recompense has actually or symbolically transpired, then one may experience the grace of release. I will never forget watching the movie The Mission. Mercenary and slaver Rodrigo Mendoza makes his living kidnapping natives and selling them to nearby plantations. Well, Mendoza finds his fiancée and younger half-brother Felipe in bed together. He kills Felipe in a duel, and even though he's acquitted of the killing, he spirals into depression. A Jesuit priest, Father Gabriel, challenges Mendoza to undertake a suitable penance. So Mendoza accompanies the Jesuits on their journey back to the native's land, constantly dragging a heavy bundle containing his armor and sword. The scene where he is struggling while dragging the heavy burden up a massive waterfall is heart-rending. After initially tense moments upon reaching the outskirts of the native's territory, even though they recognize him, they embrace a tearful Mendoza and cut away his heavy bundle. Our burden of guilt must be removed by recompense, either figuratively like Mendoza, or in the cases where that's impossible, then symbolically. So question number 1, how do I know what is true guilt? Question number 2, how do I know what is false guilt? Much of the time, perhaps usually, what we call guilt is not real guilt, as defined in number 1. It's more often a defense against a greater angst. It's a secondary response to the experience of anxiety with which it is so closely identified as to be indistinguishable at that moment. As a boy and later as a minister, I remember the old-fashioned altar call, when my heart was pounding and clenching the edge of the pew after a guilt-laden hellfire and brimstone sermon. Well, was it really religious conviction from God Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, or was it simply a false defense against anxiety? Or was it a psychosomatic symptom of anxiety rather than God's condemnation? So instead of resolving and understanding the angst, I would instead repress and repent from feelings or sins of the flesh that were really not sins at all. They were instead our basic needs like sex, belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. For example, we hear people saying they feel guilty when they say no to someone, or when they're angry, or for not being the perfect parent. Well, such feelings have been slowly conditioned through childhood. The adult and religious world has unlimited power to punish or to withhold affection and approval. And so as a child, we quickly learn to curb unacceptable impulses. We begin to internalize restraints against our impulses, and we come to lose contact with the reality of our feelings. What is called guilt then is often our protective, reactive feeling state. Here's a huge quote. Most of us are conditioned to be nice rather than real, accommodating rather than authentic, adaptive rather than assertive. It's Dr. James Hollis. Imagine a 12-step program for recovering nice persons, where one describes how they were reflexively nice during the past week and lived to regret it, or when deciding not to be nice, how guilty we felt. Hi, I'm Randy, and I was too nice this week. Well, this false guilt reflects a lack of permission to be ourselves. In such moments of guilt, we should ask the question, what am I defending myself against? Usually the matter will boil down to the fear that someone else might not be happy with my decisions. Well, pleasing others cannot be at the top of our life agenda. We are not children any longer. We are adults who are perfectly capable of living with, if it proves necessary, the displeasure of others. This guilt is false, and being blocked by guilt is still to be stuck in childhood. Guilt confines us to the past. It contaminates our present and consumes our future. We must be able to identify the kind of guilt we are suffering, and then we have at least a chance to achieve a measure of release from the bonds of the past. There's no doubt that guilt is a complex and interesting emotion. We can't live a completely guilt-free life, but we can keep it within manageable bounds.